Hi everyone, welcome to another Jacobin talk. My name is Kaye Brooks. I'm the video producer for Jacobin magazine. We have a ton of video content that we're doing on a regular basis now. We've been doing these several times a week. We're going to scale back a bit because we have two main shows every week. On Saturdays at 1 p.m. we have Weekends, and on Wednesdays we have the Jacobin show. But for Jacobin Talks, we like to cover a specific issue, sometimes more of a one-off, but I think a unique and important political topic. And we like to have especially important and informative guests like my friend and comrade Harvey J. Kaye, historian. He is the author of several books that you should be reading, including The Fight for the Four Freedoms, of What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great, FDR and Democracy, the Greatest Speeches and Writings of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as well as, probably more pertinent for tonight, Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again, and Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. And so the thing I wanted to get into with you tonight, Harvey, which we've already started to before we went live.
Yeah, right.
But we're in a moment right now where America actually does have something left of liberalism. I would say probably in large part thanks to Bernie Sanders and his two presidential campaigns. But there's been a massive kind of upsurge in both political thinking and activity and organizing on the left. And it's a strange place that we're in because in many ways, this generation that's come about right now, that's organizing, doesn't really have a real connection to the past in the way that, say, a previous generation might have. That the way the new left very quickly found their roots in the old left. Whereas our generation, we look back and there's only so many people. There's only a few people like yourself who have been carrying a left political tradition alive. And so I wanted to come to you because I wanted to try to figure this out and try to have a better sense of understanding what is basically our left political and left radical tradition in America. And so I guess I want, so I wanted to start with basically asking, because you use this term, the American radical tradition. And so I wanted to unpack that a bit and understand what we're talking about. What is the American radical tradition? What's American about it? What's radical about it? Who's a part of it? Who's not a part of it?
I date the American radical tradition to my hero, Thomas Paine. Okay, I mean and we did a whole session on Thomas Paine with Bhaskar back in September, was it? I'm forgetting.
Yeah.
Time flies, doesn't it, in a pandemic? And at the same time,
no time.
So, and I should tell everyone just that this is the first time I'm using an actual mic. So this is an experiment in technology, for what it's worth. Okay, but here's the thing, and I'll explain my project that I've been pursuing all these years. See, I think that there is something fundamentally radical about America. I mean, we could tell the story of exploitation and oppression and the story of the tragedies and ironies, and they all not only are true, but should never be forgotten. But it's also the case that, in contrast to the right that wants to celebrate history from the top down and wants us to believe that it's all divinely ordained and somehow all preordained, right? And that the greatest threat to whatever America is comes from the left, especially from socialists. Okay, they even portray non-socialists as socialists to wrap it all together. I think our task has been for too long viewed as that of revealing for lack of a better way of putting it, the underside of America, the story of capitalism and imperialism, the story of the slavery, the story of the oppression of workers, and all of that is true. But I think that if we're going to feel the power of the past, we have to not only, if you like, debunk the stories of the ruling class, we also need to be cultivating a memory of our own that will remind us that the way things are is not necessarily the way they have to be, and that in fact, and I meant to pull out one of Marx's letters, where he says, it's an early letter, 1843, and he says that the struggle really is about realizing the dream that has always been there. And in some ways, that's kind of what I've had in my mind for all these years when I've gone to work on the American radical tradition, starting back in the 90s with Paul Buell and Mary Jo Buell in a volume we did called The American Radical. I didn't train as an Americanist. I trained in Latin American studies, and then I was the historiographer of the British Marxist historians, Eric Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson and others. And one of the things that really struck me when I was doing work on American memory and the ways in which the right has always tried to suppress American memory, especially historical memory, or hijack American memory to turn it to their own corporate ends, that I thought we're failing to lay hold, the title of the book, Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again. We're failing to remember the fact that there have been not only struggles in the past, but remarkable and glorious ideals that people have fought for. And I do actually trace this back in particular in terms of an American radical tradition to Thomas Paine. And I do this not only because of my own preferences. I mean, Paine wrote Common Sense. He went on to write Rights of Man in the French Revolution. He wrote the Crisis Papers. He wrote Agrarian Justice, which becomes the founding text of what we would think of as a social democratic ideal or social democratic movement through modern history. And the reason I say it's a radical tradition is that Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, in essence, turns the rebellion of the 1770s into a revolution, and a revolution not only for independence, which, by the way, the standard school books will tell you that's what Common Sense did. It called for independence, but it did something even more fundamental. As Paine said, if it was only a matter of independence, it wouldn't have been worth pursuing. His argument was that this was a struggle for democracy. And that fact was that the new nation should be created as a model to the world as a democratic nation. We could spend time dealing with the failings of that ambition. But the fact is that that was the ideal that was established. And as a consequence, when the so-called, in quotes, founding fathers of the Continental Congress were finally pushed, and they were pushed to write the Declaration, with Jefferson drafting it, they were pushed by farmers and laborers and artisans and others from below to declare an independence that would also be an independence that says all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain fundamental rights. And we think of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, that's a critical moment in the American story, no matter how you look at it, whether it's a matter of celebrating it alone as conservatives might through the Declaration. Read Newt Gingrich on that sometime if you want, or by way of saying, look, these ideals were not fulfilled. And that's really where the American radical tradition comes in. The American radical tradition thereafter, and I'll just name a sort of historical lineage, the Revolution, the working men's parties of the 1820s, the abolitionist movement, the women's, for lack of a better way of putting it, the beginnings of the women's movement, the feminists of the 1830s, and especially 1848, Seneca Falls and thereafter. If I haven't said it before, I'll say abolitionists. Again, I'll repeat that. Similarly, the beginnings of socialism and the labor movement, anarchists of the late 19th century, capital P progressives. Again, the persistence of the socialist movement into the 20th century, the communists of the 1920s and especially the 1930s. If you look closely at their struggles, their pursuits, over and over again, they all reached back. And I apologize if I've left out one of the movements. I'll look on a list quickly. The populists. There you go. I don't want Tom Frank to be angry with me. Okay. So the fact is that every one of those movements, from the time of Paine's revolutionary launching, you might say, right through, they look back to the revolution. I mean, we were all raised on, the idea of the Declaration, but these movements look back. And by the way, as much as conservatives tried to suppress Thomas Paine's memory, every one of those movements I mentioned reached back and grabbed hold, first and foremost, Thomas Paine, to make them their historical champion, to make him their historical champion. But similarly, they even cited Washington and Jefferson, but most especially they cited the words of the Declaration. Okay, those opening, was second paragraph, I guess it is, or secondary set of lines. all men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they use this in many ways as a weapon, for lack of a better word in my head right now, because they wanted to hold America accountable. Okay, they didn't necessarily simply accuse America of failing to live up to it. They were intent upon realizing that anew in every generation and redefining. If we go to the Constitution and the preamble, they were prepared, they were eager to redefine the we the people. They wanted to make sure the we the people included the people. Moreover, they wanted to make sure that we the people had the powers of the people. So the idea was it was a struggle for inclusion and also a struggle for enhancing, expanding, extending, and deepening the powers of the people. And so I mean, I could cite, individuals. If we think about, for example, well, the Working Men's Party is always interesting. The leading figures of that included such figures as Frances Wright, Fanny Wright, who actually, essentially worshipped the memory of Thomas Paine and the revolution as a feminist and a significant figure in the Working Men's Party in that case, 1830s. Thomas Skidmore was making an argument for redistribution of property by grabbing hold of Paine and Jefferson and then pushing them beyond the bounds that they themselves had set. We can go on. Frederick Douglass, although he disavowed the United States for years when he worked alongside William Lloyd Garrison. Lloyd Garrison is the abolitionist who was more than prepared to split the Union, because he said for the northern states to remain a part of a union with the southern states in slavery was utterly not only against the ideals, the better ideals of the Declaration, but was utterly immoral in any Christian sense. But I'll also point out that William Lloyd Garrison on his own newspaper had quotes of Thomas Paine and others of the founders to make his case, especially Thomas Paine, by the way. And Frederick Douglass at a certain point split with William Lloyd Garrison and was taught by Gerrit Smith. Is Gerrit Wright? I always get the name confused. Anyhow, Gerrit Smith. I wrote it down before. It doesn't matter. The point is the Free Soiler and Liberty Party figure who taught him to read the American founding documents in what he believed was a more radical way, that it was a denial of slavery and not a sanctification of slavery. And Douglass himself then, in the famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," first lambastes America for slavery, but makes it clear ultimately that he's lambasting it because of the, for lack of a better word, the hypocrisy of these grand ideals that are denied in practice. And then at the end, he says, "And yet I have hope." Okay. He believes that those ideals themselves are more powerful than those who are denying them. And then you can go on. I mean, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was, I could tell the full story. We don't have time for it here. She was taught by earlier feminists to keep by her bedside the writings of especially Thomas Paine and possibly, and I think it was Mary Wollstonecraft, who was English, undeniably, okay, but Thomas Paine, and she herself she is a free thinker as well as a feminist, and therefore Thomas Paine becomes all the more significant because of his own deist free thinking beliefs. Susan B. Anthony in 1872, her partner in the ensuing struggle for the right to vote, persuades the folks in New York, way up in New York State, that she should be able to vote. She actually does cast a vote in, I think it's the election of 1872 or 1876. And she's then charged with, having committed a crime. And she went on a speaking tour and kept quoting Thomas Paine to the effect from one of his writings where he says, "The right to vote is the right that protects all other rights." The point here is, and again, I can go all the way through, and if anyone's listening and has access to YouTube afterward, plug in Paul Robeson, Ballad for Americans, okay, 1930s, written by two remarkable communists, one a lyricist and the other, songwriter. And it's a song that lays claim on the part of the popular front of the 1930s of communist socialists fighting liberals and radicals, that lays claim to American history going back to the revolution. It's a great 11 to 13 minute song done in a sort of call and answer with the People's Choir or the New York People's Chorus, something like that. Fantastic. Okay. So when I say American radical tradition, it's not just that I line them all up and show the fact that that Americans have always generated a struggle for rights. Okay, many of those emanating, in fact, not simply from the minds of elites, but from working people themselves. What I say is that it's not simply that; it's also the fact that they themselves reach back to earlier generations. In fact, many of them look back, most recently to generations. The one I really want to cite, though, maybe this will make my point the best, is Eugene Debs. I mean, let's go with a socialist, okay? So right? I mean, Eugene Debs during World War I generally remained silent on the war, by the way, however much he opposed it, until he got to the point he could no longer remain silent and gave a speech in 1917, which led to his being charged with sedition under the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917-18 under Woodrow Wilson's presidency. And when he went into court to defend his actions, he in one of the trials, he actually defends himself. He doesn't ask for a lawyer. He actually stands there in the courtroom. I wish we could make a movie with this scene. It's just remarkable. And he ends up calling into the courtroom the ghosts, you might say, of Thomas Paine, Thaddeus Stevens. He goes through every generation of American radicalism and invites them into the classroom, including Abraham Lincoln for his dissent on the Mexican War and his generally, radical stance in American history in Deb's imagination, and in many ways, truthful imagination, as you and I hope we'll get to talk about it a bit later. And so what he's done is he stands there to defend himself in terms of the radical tradition of America. So when I think about the radical tradition, I think about the fact that this is a bit chauvinism, I think the American radical tradition is the most remarkable tradition in this country, and possibly distinguishes us from many another country where they may have great revolutionaries and great radical heroes, but the persistent radicalism and the diversity of the radicalism is truly, I mean, I know the left hates this term, but it's almost exceptional in its character. So that's what I mean by it. Okay.
Right. Well, I think what's so important about what you're talking about, and like the essence of that tradition of ordinary working people, poor people, the masses of people fighting back. Part of it, there are certain Enlightenment ideals that are kind of the bedrock of the left, and that comes back, of course, like you're saying, to Thomas Paine. But it's this understanding that every single life has certain unique value, that there is, the injustice to one is an injustice to all, and the tradition that really embodies, these values go through the left, go through socialism, go through the labor movement. There's a fundamental truth that when people are being oppressed, when people are being beaten down, when people do not have full autonomy and full freedom over their livelihood, over how they spend the majority of their waking lives, that there is resentment, there is very often opposition to that. And then it turns into a question of capacity, right? And so the left understands that people naturally are opposed to their subjugation, they're opposed to their domination. And so in that way, anywhere and always when you have capitalism, or you have these class-based systems, these systems based on a handful of wealthy and powerful individuals, basically making their livelihoods off of the sweat and labor of everyone else, you're going to have the majority of those people that are, if not resentful, at least they might be open to another option, and that other option is dependent on political organizing, on capacity. And so I think, in some ways, I think there's something deeply universal that we're talking about of people opposing oppression, opposing exploitation, opposing domination, that you find that all over the world, regardless of culture, regardless of
Right.
region, religion, race, ethnicity, whatever it is, that there's something deeply human about that. But then,
Absolutely, I
right,
absolutely agree. But unique nations and cultures have different formations, you might say, of how
right,
that comes to be expressed. And in the American radical tradition, whether many of the folks on the left appreciate it or not, it's the rights tradition which has been so central to that. So even
right.
Emma Goldman herself was a champion for free speech in her day and was celebrated for that reason. And
Emma
so
Goldman, the anarchist for
the
people
anarchist,
who don't,
right?
yeah,
That's right. And here's one of the things to remember, that in if we look closely, sorry, you put me off in another direction when you said something. There was an old practice amongst Marxists to think in terms of class, class consciousness, class struggle. You start, you have classes. Classes have to develop a consciousness, and then they enter a struggle. But I think we've matured intellectually, and historically we've come to understand that likely it's class struggle that comes first, because the social relations of production are characterized by exploitation and oppression, and because exactly for the reason you said, people resist. Sometimes they resist individually, sometimes they come to have a form of solidarity, they resist collectively, occasionally they rebel, and even occasionally revolt, stage
mm,
revolutions. Well, the point is, the struggles themselves, if you think about it, if there's something like a development of things, the struggles themselves emerge almost instinctively because of the kinds of very things you said, Kale. It's in the course of the struggle that one develops the consciousness.
right.
And to what extent the consciousness will itself develop a vision may well depend, as Gramsci used to say, on what organic intellectuals cultivate within the struggle. So in the case here in America, then the United States, Thomas Paine was a remarkable organic intellectual. He came out of he was a working man who had also a certain level of education. And by the way, English artisans, the milieu out of which he came, was autodidactic. It was, in many ways, we have a problem in the stories we tell. People think Paris is the home of the Enlightenment, but in fact, it may well be that London is the source of the Enlightenment, and because of the ideas of natural philosophy and the autodidactic pride they took in it, the English artisans, out of which Paine emerges, and the willingness to challenge the authority and the dogmas of the day. And so Paine arrives with this sort of sense of the world, not to mention his own experiences and struggle, and discovers in America that there's already a rebellion underway, but it's a rebellion conducted in the terms of the English tradition, the rights of the freeborn Englishman, which does not include the idea of democracy. Okay, it's a liberty kind of ideal. And what Paine does is he sees that Americans have already staged something of a revolution, but have yet to see that they have it in their power, as he said, to begin the world over, start the world over again. And that's his task, so to speak, in common sense. Well, similarly, that's the source of a tradition, itself rooted in a previous tradition, perhaps. And then in every generation, the capacity to turn struggles into movements and movements into, mass movements may well depend on those kinds of things. I've gone a little bit away from where we were supposed to move, but
No, this is perfect, because this is ultimately what I want us to center on, which is this question of basically what are the mechanisms by which working people and ordinary people actually do achieve some kind of progressive social outcome. So a little less jargony, but basically,
yeah. Well, the first thing we should remember is that working people are, one of the things I think was Gramsci. Sorry, I resort to Gramsci when pushed. I think it was Gramsci who talked about that. Basically, we're all intellectuals. We all think. Okay, just some of us spend more time doing it, and in fact, some are paid to do it. Those who are paid to do it are either middle class types, such as myself as a professor, or indeed the ones that get paid big bucks by the corporations to spread propaganda by way of advertising and other kinds of messages. But what we have to remember is that within communities, within communities, within solidarities, there are already ideals and ideas. And we should consider the fact that it may well be, to use one of my famous historian friends who's passed away and I'm responsible for his work now, George Rude, he talked about the fact that there's mother's milk of ideas. And growing up in America, for all of the corruption and everything else, does involve a sort of absorption or a suckling, if you like, at a tradition that demands a recognition, at least, even if not, practiced in the way it should be: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Oh, and by the way, and I maybe this will segue back a bit. So, for example, I mean, working men and women in the 19th century, and I refer to movements, working men and women were able to be mobilized into these movements or organized into these movements because they took seriously those ideals. It isn't only that the organic intellectuals I was referring to, they took seriously, they grew up with that sensibility, and they were smart enough, they didn't have to be told, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was not the characteristic of their lives. All right. So basically speaking, it's available, right? It's available. And the question, of course, is to what degree it becomes itself mobilized, these ideals and these ideas. And that's where you're hoping I can give you the magic key to this kind of thing. All I can say is that when you look close, we're a very highly literate society, and we have been so actually ever since the revolution. And as a consequence, it doesn't always have to be that there's some local leader with ideas, and the ideas themselves are propagated in books and in newspapers and otherwise. And movements themselves, okay, really do become phenomenal when they realize the degree, how they can spread the word and mobilize people. A good example, I mentioned Tom Frank before, so let's go to the populists. The populists begin as farmers' organizations who are basically organizing maybe to set up co-ops, maybe to resist the banks, to resist the prices the railroads are charging them for freight, that kind of thing. And one of the things they realize is that perhaps they couldn't trust the prevailing media, okay? The newspapers of the cities. They may well have needed their own, if you like, modes of communication. They actually generated lecturers. And this was a very usual thing in the 19th century when social movements got themselves going, is they created lecturers. They would underwrite personages, figures who would travel from place to place as a way of creating solidarities that weren't immediately in the community. Okay. By the way, this may actually be why podcasts, etc., have a role they have yet to fully realize, but we can talk about that later or another time. So, I mean, and by the way, and then on a certain scale, these lecturers themselves, having spread the word, people are yearning to hear more about this and to connect with others. So in the populists, and by the way, the socialists, if you look at the late 19th century, the socialists inherit a lot of what the populists have begun to do. The populists of the early 1890s are holding vast, what we would call revival meetings out on the plains and out on the prairies. And thousands of people would show up, not simply for the entertainments available, but they wanted to hear the lecturers. They wanted to hear about economics and politics and what farmers and rural workers could do in the struggle. They wanted to elect people to office, and they were very successful. I mean, that's why Tom Frank asked, what's the matter with Kansas? Because once upon a time, Kansas had actually elected a whole series of populists. We might well say here in Wisconsin, we had socialist mayors of Milwaukee for some generations. My point is that you have to develop modes of communication. You've got to be able to move out beyond your confines in order to rally people. And then, of course, you can talk about moving in a political direction and getting people elected. Sorry, I know I monopolized that. Forgive me, okay?
No, it's okay. No, I think the examples are useful because they really do make this more concrete. But like part of the thing that I think we have to figure out on the left, and especially this generation right now, that is in fact, which is it's a good thing that we're actually facing real political challenges and we're actually solving real problems in our organizing work or in in what demands we make, what tactics we employ. which was not true of say 10 years ago when it was mostly in like coffee shops. Like,
Right.
so that we have progressed to a point where we actually do need to now get a sense of what works strategically, right? Because the fact is that throughout all of throughout history, there is something, like I was saying a moment ago, there's something human about resistance, but there's a problem where that resistance doesn't naturally lead to some kind of collective action or some kind of collective struggle or some kind of collective fight. It can, and of course it does, and that's when we come to these kind of flashpoints in history, or these important moments where there's strikes, there's revolts, there's revolutions, but that's not the norm, right? And so I think part of it is I think it's a two-pronged thing that we have to figure out. It's the first is, why is it that working people who certainly have an interest in overturning the system, why are they unable to? Why do they get stuck in the kind of the exploitation, the oppression, the domination? Why can't they leave that arrangement, or why can't they fight back? And then the next question is, when they are successful in fighting back, what are the means by which they actually do, right? How is it that working people, ordinary people, it's funny, I remember hearing someone say recently that, like, like the individual has extremely limited power, and it's more or less, it's kind of true. It's basically true, but it also kind of erases the class structure, which is that I as an individual, you as an individual, have far less power than Jeff Bezos has as an individual, or as Joe Biden has as an individual, right? And so it's taking into account the institutions, the class structure,
Yeah.
and it's an active question for us on the left of, how do we solve the collective action problem? How do we actually get ordinary people, ordinary working people, with ordinary levels of power that we have over our lives, which in capitalism is extremely limited? How do we multiply that so that it then becomes a fighting, that we have a fighting chance against, the ruling class effectively?
Yeah. Well, okay. Two different directions emerge. Okay. And Kaye, it's possible we want to leave the Washington, Lincoln, and FDR for another conversation. Okay.
No, we should still do that.
Oh, really? I wanted to make sure we had time for people to ask questions or to challenge something if they.
We'll get some. We'll do some questions at the end. I'll make sure that we get some. So
Okay.
leave questions for us, chat, but also hold them in your head until I tell you.
Okay. I have a hard enough time holding it in my head until you tell me. But okay, let me first say something which will reveal the difference in our ages if it wasn't evident from our faces. Okay. I will never forget. I mean, I've been a member of DSA for a long time, and I'm still sort of more influenced by the Michael Harrington DSA than anything else. And Harrington, I think it was his words, speak American. That was a dictum of his. Okay. Speak American. And I think that's essential. If you're going to look, it's all well and good to have an organization of socialists and create a great solidarity amongst socialists. That's magnificent. But we're never going to be the mass party until other Americans are convinced that we have something to say that connects to their lives. Okay, which it means two things. It means not only do we have to commit ourselves to pursuing the kinds of things that we already know the majority of Americans want, like we used to call it when I was young, socialized healthcare. Okay, then it became national healthcare, so it didn't sound like socialism. And then it became universal healthcare. And now we've got this term, and Bernie was smart, Medicare for all. Okay, he grabbed hold of a victory in the 1960s by Lyndon Johnson and the labor movement of securing Medicare for all. Okay, of Medicare, and then now the idea of Medicare for all. So we should be thinking about, first of all, how do we connect to what people want? I mean, one thing we know is that we are now living at a terrible. What was the line out of Dickens for the French Revolution? The best of times and the worst of times, and that may be the case for us, because the best of times, as you said earlier, is we now live at a time in which, if you say the left, even if we can't fully describe it, we know that there's this this movement, this possibility that prevails. And so, but we have to be able to speak out beyond that. We shouldn't take for granted that it's merely generational, that when we say working class, we mean only one black, brown, or white. We've got to really kind of address what working people desire, and the connection between black, brown, and white working class in terms of what they want is pretty common, okay, except for the imperative of Black Lives Matter, okay, which clearly emerges out of what was once the civil rights movement and Black Power and so on and so forth.
And I mean, even when you look at the polling, when you ask ordinary working class Black people what they want, and they've done, I think there was a poll, I think it was through the New York Times, and it might have been, I think it was Alicia Garza who did this, that the top issues are healthcare, wages.
Right. That's right.
It's
ground for solidarity.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, the left has historically said the group of people that we see as our historic actor, kind of the ones that are going to bring about progressive change in the world, are working people. And it just so happens to be that in the United States, the working class is pretty black and brown because that's who the working class is, right?
Right.
That it's not by virtue of a race, it's their strategic capabilities are derived from their class position, their place in the class structure. But in America, it happens to be Black people, happens to be Hispanic people. It also happens to be white people. That we have in America a multiracial working class. That might not be the same situation in India, or the same, the working class is going to look a little different in China. But there's something.
But we should not be naive to the divisions there either. But
right.
I just wanted to bring it back to the question you posed. Okay, sorry, and that is, so first, I think it's imperative that we speak American in the sense of that we speak to people's wants and needs, hopes and aspirations, but then we should also remember that they carry the same kind of deep cultural memory or mother's milk that we all do. Okay. And what I mean by that is that they too learned about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as an ideal. Okay. And they're not oblivious to the denial. And by the way, surveys done back in the 90s, studies, interviews back in the 90s showed that actually most Americans carry around with them. This is the thing that it really shook me. I was really pleased because it gave me reason to believe my work, not that I had made anything happen, but my work would feed into something dynamic, is that when Americans were asked, they actually understood the struggles that went into the making of democracy as it prevailed today, for all of its faults and failings. They also admittedly thought that there was something divine about America, but that's not, I'm not going to worry about that right now. Well, so what I want to say is that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not a 1770s idea alone. And I'll show you what I mean. Abraham Lincoln grabbed hold of it as a way of articulating a fundamental understanding of the need for the end of slavery. And he did a great, he actually truly believed that his fellow Americans understood what he was saying when he said, we know we need to, bring an end to slavery. This is the only way to save the Union. You don't save the Union to eventually end slavery. You end slavery to save the Union. And the reason the Union needed to be saved was not merely nationalism. He made it clear that, as Thomas Paine did, that it could potentially be a model to the world, just for the record, okay? But then what's really great is Franklin Roosevelt, for all these, no man is perfect, no woman is perfect. They had their sins and we could take them apart if we wanted. But they did advance the democratic idea, and they did so not only rhetorically, but politically and economically. And when he was running for president in 1932, he gave a speech that becomes the foundations of an ongoing process for him, in which he called for an economic declaration of rights. He said, look, we had a Declaration of Independence in 1776. For too long in favor of economic growth, we've allowed, I'll paraphrase him, we've allowed corporate titans to run amok. Okay. And and our problem in the midst of this depression is a consequence of not having reined in the power of these corporate titans. And as a consequence, the vast majority of Americans can't even buy the necessities of life. And he said, it's time we attend to the forgotten man and we rebuild America from the bottom up. And he then cited life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He said, look, for life, you must have a job.
Harvey, you froze for a second, I think. Unless I froze.
I'm back.
Harvey, let me know when you're.
Okay, good.
There we go. There you go. Yes.
It was an
there
internet connection,
Sorry
so
about
I
that.
apologize if it was at my end. Okay.
No worries.
Yeah,
you were talking
yeah.
about
So
going
the
radical
point is
for a
that in
generation.
1932, Roosevelt lays hold of the Declaration to make a call for an economic declaration of rights, because he said we've lost touch with that original social contract. And he said, for life, you need to have a job that pays a living wage. Liberty, well, needy men are not free men. And happiness, and he opens the door to that question of how to secure human happiness. Now, that's a speech he gave to rich people in San Francisco, demanding that they prepare themselves for what will become the New Deal. Then, in the course of his presidency, he returns to this theme of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And ultimately, besides the Four Freedoms speech of 1941, he proclaims the imperative of an economic Bill of Rights. Now, it isn't only Roosevelt who's doing this. He's actually run polls, private polls. I think I mentioned this the last time we talked. The White House commissioned polls to ask Americans, what do you want after the war? So that when he gave his State of the Union address in January of 44 and announces this list of measures that he calls the Economic Bill of Rights, he knows he's speaking not for himself, but he's speaking for the overwhelming majority of Americans. So, for example, 85% of Americans wanted national health care in 1944. 85%. And if I can just sidebar that, the reason it didn't happen had to do with the corporate powers that be, the AMA, and Southern Democrats, who would later come to be known as Dixiecrats. The shocker is, how could it be that in 2020, there were Northern Democrats who were prepared to veto the idea of universal health care? But that we all know about. And the question is, how could that have come to be when the majority of Americans still want national health care? But what he does, Roosevelt, is he's grabbing hold of an American story, and he's proposing this. And by the way, both the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which were separate entities in those days, later they'll be the AFL-CIO, they both got on the bandwagon. They both launched major campaigns, not simply to reelect Roosevelt, but to pursue the enactment or securing of an economic Bill of Rights. And I can't tell you if it had not been for the fact, look, the nation was still divided in a fundamental way between an apartheid South and an admittedly racist, but by no means apartheid North in law. So there were any number of obstacles to securing it, but he literally put together this coalition, and working people wanted it. And how was it prevented? It was prevented by way of, they won the election, but eventually it's another story. We have to learn how to speak American, not only in terms of speaking to our fellow citizens in terms of their needs and their wants and hopes and aspirations, but also in terms of their understanding of what progressive action would be about. And you and I have talked over and over again about the need for Medicare for all, guaranteed job, collective bargaining rights. You know, the majority of Americans are now supporting unionization efforts, intellectually. We're at a really interesting moment. I mean, I'll just lament one more time in public. God, if only Bernie had been the... I did it. Okay.
It's okay. We all got to do it.
Okay.
If only. But this is, I mean, but your question of, why didn't it happen? In some ways, it seems like the more relevant question is, why was it even possible? When have working people actually been able to get universal healthcare? Because we're up against the most powerful forces in human history, between capitalism as an economic system, as a system that distributes resources and divides us into classes where some of us own the vast majority of things, and most of us have to then work for those people. And then the actual
Work for them if we're
people,
lucky in this day, at this
right,
moment.
right. The only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited,
Right.
right?
Oh, yeah, you
But
know that line. Good. I'm
yeah,
glad you do.
yeah. But ultimately, it's, when we look to the record, it's not, there's a tension here that I want us to kind of get to, and this is maybe how I'll get to the final chunk of this. I promise, because the tensions between the fact that political debate, political ideas, disseminating political ideas are extremely important, and yet it's not. The left is more or less, we kind of uphold the tradition of materialism, which is a fancy word for saying that we don't think that the fact that someone has an idea in their head automatically translates into change in the world, right? It's not just that I have this great idea and I want to share it with you, and now the fact that we're sharing it, that we're actively changing the world,
Yeah.
that it's an important part of that process, but that alone, ideas on their own, the left at least historically has said ideas alone do not change the world. It's how they're implemented. It's the means by, it's how someone, it's not the ideas, it's this other thing, which is that people through various mechanisms, through certain forms of association, of working with one another, building relationships, and of bringing together collective power, they're able to
Right.
implement certain things,
Okay.
right?
Well,
And so, hold
yeah.
on, wait, I want to get to the question.
Sorry. Okay.
No, I know, but the question basically, because so much of history is written as, as what I just said, of it's this kind of this random walk where things just kind of happen, and then one day someone has a great idea and they do something about it and they change the world.
Right.
And
Otherwise said as one damn thing after another.
right, yeah,
Yeah.
right. It's kind of, as much as I love Adam Curtis, the filmmaker, he's also guilty of this, because he does, in his movies, he'll do this thing where something will happen, or he's kind of, the movie's progressing, and then he'll say, and then a funny thing happened one day. And it's like, there's like kind of the mainstream, both liberal but also conservative understanding of history, where it's just a funny thing happened one day, and someone, someone becomes great because they do something great, and they have achieved their highest ideals and have made the world a better or worse place.
It sounded like you could write a script for Animaniacs. Do you know Animaniacs?
Yes,
The
yeah,
cartoons? Okay.
yeah. That's a good callback.
Look, I love Pinky and the Brain. Just I want to go on
Yes.
record. I love Pinky and the Brain. So
We got it on record, folks.
yeah.
No, but this, as a radical historian and as a progressive, as a socialist, we have a slightly different understanding of that course of events. It's not just that people get a good idea and the world changes. And so I wanted you to kind of address this, and specifically address this through the presidents who are typically considered great. So you've just talked about FDR and the importance of,
Right.
FDR has these ambitions and these ideals, but it's not the fact that he has the ideals that the change happens. It's something else that is the catalyst that kind of spurs on that change.
Okay, hold on. We're gonna have a consultation in front of an audience. Okay.
Right.
We've been here 50 minutes, and we always end up going overtime, you and I. But I'm not against going overtime. But I want to make sure I don't want to leave people behind who have questions about what we've been talking about. So I'm telling you now, if you want, we could treat this as what it is, and in the new year we could come to the question of radical transformation. I'm going to leave it to you, okay?
I mean, I'm fine going a little overboard, I think. I mean, if you want to, or not overboard, a little over time. If you want to, I think it would be worth it to go through some of the examples that we talked about before of
Okay.
Washington.
Yeah, okay, because we'll tell everyone that when we first began speaking of this, we're really interested in, can the working class make a difference? I mean, crudely put, okay? And the point, of course, is that the great radical transformations that we've seen in American life, which we'll talk about in a moment, were a consequence of struggles from the bottom up by working people, okay? And I'll start off by saying that all Americans, if you ask them, who are the three greatest presidents in American history, they will tell you Washington, Lincoln, and Roosevelt, unless you're talking to a group of conservatives and somehow or other they will ask you about Ronald Reagan. Forget it. Okay. He was phenomenal, by the way. We definitely should not fail to talk about him sometime and what the left might have to learn from him. But in any case, Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. And although, in fact, much of Washington's, in quotes, greatness had to do with his leadership of an army as opposed to his presidential term. Okay. Although he was a remarkable president. Look, let's also go on record before we go further. We know Washington was a slaveholder. We are not canonizing him. Okay. Let's be clear. Okay. We know that Roosevelt committed terrible and tragic mistakes, decisions of. We know
Right.
that.
Well, we're analyzing
Right.
as historians.
But one of the things I want,
people,
so we know those three are the three greatest. Go out in the street, ask anyone, they'll tell you that. Ask them why. Ask Americans why, and they'll pause for a moment, and then they'll probably say, well, you had Washington, the Revolutionary War, and you had Lincoln and the Civil War, and then they'll likely go without a beat, skipping a beat, they'll say FDR and World War II. But then if you get into a conversation with them, you discover that they have a deeper memory. And here's what I want to get at. And this is what I have spent quite a few years pushing. If you actually think about what made them truly great, it's that each one of them, for a start, led America, the United States, through mortal crises. So yes, a Revolutionary War, a Civil War. In the case of Roosevelt, however, the 1930s Great Depression and the New Deal that developed to respond to it, and World War II. Now, here's the thing that really struck me. I don't think I came up with this thought more than 5 or 6 years ago in the wake of writing the Thomas Paine book and then the FDR book, and that is, isn't it remarkable that when push comes to shove, I'm going to put it as plainly as I can because I'm going to do it the way I do it in a classroom. When push comes to shove, something happens in American life where Americans, and this, by the way, and I'm going to show you specifically among working people who make this happen, Americans transcend, they beat their enemies and they transcend the crises by radically transforming the United States. And now you can argue about what radical means, but when I explain it with examples, I hope you'll buy into my argument. And I even go so far as to say, to some extent, revolutionary change, considering the moments in which these things transpired. Now, what am I getting at? Well, the first thing to understand is that it isn't only the working people themselves who make it happen. It's not that. It's that there was an FDR advisor once said, Americans are lucky people. If it wasn't for Washington, we never would have become a nation. If it wasn't for Lincoln, we would have divided in two. If not for Roosevelt, we would have ended up with a dictatorship. Okay. Now, if those three gentlemen were half as smart as I think they probably were, they would deny it had to do with luck, and they would fully grant that had it not been the pushes that they received, the changes might not have happened. So in the 1770s, the question arose. Americans came to perceive their colonial relationship with Britain as oppressive. This was true across the board, oppressive. Okay, whether you were rich or not rich, that's how because of the imposition of taxes, the imposition of rules and regulations, the controls, eventually the occupation of Boston and Massachusetts by the British Army, those kinds of things. And strangely enough, one of the first people who was willing to take up arms, and he said this in the Virginia legislature, the House of Burgesses, whatever it was called, was Washington. Washington actually was prepared to take up arms against the British. Now, when he was willing to do that, he didn't say, I'm sure it didn't even cross his mind necessarily that might become a revolution for independence. It said he came to believe that if you're going to try to reduce the colonial relations oppressiveness, you had to fight it for. Okay. So to make the longer story short there, the American people themselves, as I've said before, in the course of 1773, 1774, their resistance turned to rebellion. They had thrown out basically British authority. And in the Continental Congress, it was determined that they would create an army to withstand what they presumed to be the arrival of British forces on a grand scale. And what's notable is that even when the army is created, it's not a revolutionary army. It's an army of a bunch of colonies, right? And Washington and his officers and his men believe they're going to fight for the rights of freeborn Britons. Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, comes out in January of 1776. During the month of January, when Washington is having dinner with his officers, they always began the meals by toasting the king. Even in January of 76, they'd already been at war. They're already at war, okay? Already at war. Paine's pamphlet emerges. It becomes literally one of the most incredible bestsellers in American history. Washington writes to one of his capital S secretaries, who I think is in Philadelphia, and he's writing this from probably somewhere in New Jersey, because he's retreating across New Jersey. And he says his name might have been Joseph Reed. I apologize for forgetting his actual name right now. And he says, this pamphlet, Common Sense, is working a wondrous change in the minds of the men. This is the first time in the course of this letter where Washington is revealing a possible commitment to the idea of independence. And by the way, this is taking place all across the Eastern Seaboard in the colonies. Town hall meetings and stuff are sending messages, if you like, to Philadelphia. How about an independence, a separation? Now, what propels Washington is not Washington's, he's an ambitious guy, Washington. The British didn't ever give him a regular commission in their army, and he's now the general of an American army. But what leads him to the realization of the possibility of a new nation is the working men who are in his forces, farmers and laborers and artisans, who, by the way, are more diverse than the movies portray them. When Washington first arrived in Massachusetts with his own Virginia colonial troops, which was the makings, if you like, of the Continental Army, he arrives and sees that the New England militias are multiracial. They're Native Americans and African Americans and many a people of mixed racial background. And by the way, at first he's very upset because these militias are sloppy. Okay. And he's also concerned about the fact that they're so multiracial because Congress has told him not to recruit not to recruit black troops into the army. So he issues an order basically saying that, they're not to serve. And then eventually basically tells the Continental Congress, you've got to change the orders. We need these black troops. And by the end of the revolution, I think up to 1 of every 5 of the Continental Army was African-American, or at least a person of color in the army. Well, the point is, these are working people who are creating a new nation and decidedly a republic, and the makings, at least, of a democratic republic, the propulsion to transform these colonies into a United States that offers the promise, at least, of a democratic republic. That emerges from below and pushes the likes of Washington to sign on, and then of course the rest of the what we call the founding fathers down in Philadelphia. So that's the first thing. So what I tell my students is that it's really important to understand that what makes Washington, and then eventually, if we have time, I'll explain Lincoln and Roosevelt too, or we could do that another time, whatever you want to do, is the fact that it isn't just a war; it's that Americans find it in themselves to radically transform what will become the nation. And I'm going to add a couple of things to that, because I know there's a great deal. I know the left is very skeptical of these kinds of arguments, but let us not forget that they also created a United States which had separation of church and state. You should never take that lightly, even if you're an atheist, because it also means you don't have to believe, okay, that separation of church and state. So that's crucial. So there are, okay. And moreover, I want to make it also clear that this is the beginning of the end of slavery as a consequence of the revolution. And the very first people to lay hold of the Declaration to use it as a weapon in court are actually African Americans in New England. So the revolution occurs because working people have set upon a task that Thomas Paine defined as, we're going to start the world over again. I mean, Lincoln and Roosevelt would take us time. What do you want to do?
Let's do those another time. But
Okay.
I think the example that you're providing is illustrative of kind of the greater point here, right? Which is that, that people in power end up needing to be pushed into doing these things, that it's especially when it comes to like progressive outcomes of fighting, whether it's conservative forces, the ruling class. It typically, like, if you're going to be fighting on behalf of ordinary people, it's not going to be just through that person in that situation's goodwill, that that we cannot rely on their morality or their ethics, that it fundamentally comes down to the social pressure, the social forces that are able to basically reshuffle the choices that political actor has.
Right. And if I could just add as a sidebar to that, because we're not going to get to them, one of the advantages of those later moments in history is both Lincoln and Roosevelt wanted to be pushed.
Right.
Which we can come back to. Okay.
Right. And of course, we're abstracting momentarily away from
sure,
George Washington is not living in capitalism, really. It's kind of a proto, there's something,
right.
There's
it's
capitalistic aspects.
It's a mercantile order, but not the capitalism that we're familiar with. Right.
Right. And Lincoln, in his case, the North is capitalist, the South is capitalist in a sense, but it's a kind of an archaic, vicious process of labor extraction, of production, with slavery kind of that's been stuck inside of markets and inside. But the point, and by FDR, it's unambiguous that that's capitalism.
Right.
But the point being, it's totally tangential. But the point being, I mean, it does matter to an extent, though, because what system you're in, and basically the rules of who's in what position largely dictates what kind of power they have, right? So that a working person, part of the significance of working people and of the working class that the left comes back to is the fact that they are at the heart of the production process, that, capitalism is a system based on profits. It's based on competition and of capitalists trying to maximize profits and minimize costs. And because it's cutthroat between these various capitalists trying to make that profit, if they don't, and it if they don't, then they're out of the game and they lose. And so their workers can wage a battle to say, I will fight you over your ability to make the profit this week, this month. And unless you give in to someone's banging some shit in the other room.
Somebody's making your dinner, maybe.
But if basically we're gonna force you to make concessions at the end of the day, that our costs on you, the obstruction costs that we're going to incur on you, are going to be greater than what you could have made if you just gave in to our demands, right?
Although, and I do want to point out, even in the case of the American Revolution, the for lack of a better word, the governing classes or ruling classes in each of the colonies picked up pretty quickly the scent of a class revolution. They actually did fear. They really did fear the possibilities of a class-based revolution that would overthrow their power. Okay, there's Elbridge Gerry, I think is his name, from New England. He said, if we don't start to try to master this struggle, we're going to suffer it. That kind of thing.
Right. I do want to give some questions. I'm sure we'll just keep talking as we go through the questions. So, okay, a couple of good ones in here already. But people send questions to the chat now. I'm looking at them. An easy one that we should do, someone was just asking, what are the best books on Thomas Paine? Well, boy, do we have a recommendation for you.
I have two recommendations. Let's see, two recommendations. Okay, three recommendations. First of all, if you want to say specifically to the American Revolution. Eric Foner's book, Thomas Paine, and I think it's called And the American Revolution, is serious, scholarly, and inspiring study. Okay, Eric Foner first. If I didn't mention that book, Eric would think that I had lost my memory. It really was an important book in my own thinking about
Tom Paine and the Revolutionary
Tom
America.
Paine and Revolutionary America. That's it. Yeah. Tom Paine and Revolutionary. The second thing, and I hope you'll forgive my Kaye had it up at the beginning. Okay, Thomas Paine and the Promise of America, which actually is a study of Paine's life and labors, and then is the story of the American radical tradition inspired by and always laying claim to the legacy of Paine and the Revolution. And I hope you like it. It was in one sense, it was my love letter to America. And it was the beauty of writing that book for me is that I just learned that the American story that needs to be told was being denied for much too long. And the third thing I want to recommend is I want to urge people to pick up a copy of Common Sense, Thomas Paine's pamphlet. This pamphlet, which in its original state was somewhere between 45 and 50 pages. And the language may seem a little archaic, but it's the one pamphlet of that time, the only pamphlet of the Revolution, which not only had the kind of sales that it garnered, and also was literally the foremost document of the American Revolution. During the Revolution, it was considered more important by people to read Common Sense than to know the Declaration. Okay, later the Declaration becomes the primary document. And I want you to keep it bedside. Good radicals have always kept Common Sense bedside, or the writings of Thomas Paine. That includes major feminists, okay, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others. And it wouldn't hurt to keep the crisis paper, the first one, okay, These Are the Times That Try Men's Souls, next to the bed. But if you really want to get into the social democratic Thomas Paine, you could look at parts of Rights of Man that was written during the French Revolution, and the pamphlet, which is very short, Agrarian Justice, which is the origins of our idea for social security in the Western world. He lays out the first model of social security right there. Not to mention, in an age in which Bernie has placed on the agenda the possibility of free public higher education, Thomas Paine proposed that young people, on reaching the age of maturity, adulthood, be given a grant of money to use as a way of getting themselves started in adult life, which could have easily been imagined for education, buying farmland, or maybe setting up a small trade. Paine, to me, is the fount of our revolutionary tradition, our radical tradition. And in Common Sense, late in the pamphlet, you'll come across the line, which may well have been the most revolutionary line of modern history, maybe more revolutionary than the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. And that line is, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And that resonated with artisans and farmers in such a way that they staged a revolution.
Great. So we have a bunch more questions, and I want to try to get to a few more of them. Idle Bystander is asking, how do we get power and position to successfully push leaders who want to be pushed? What key things need to be in place to make this happen? So this is kind of what we've been trying to get at.
Yeah.
They also suggest warlike national mobilization seems key. The phrase sounds appealing, but I don't know.
I have a thought.
Yes.
One of the reasons I wrote Take Hold of Our History, it's a set of speeches and essays, is the realization that right now we are living through a crisis in American life, not unlike the 1770s, the 1860s, and the 1930s. And I'll explain what I mean. We have been living through 45 years, soon I'll be having to say 50 years, of what the great Marxist political scientist Ralph Miliband called class war from above. And what we've seen is that, look, they smashed labor unions and broke up solidarities. They destroyed communities. They took away even pension benefits. They went after the rights of people of color to vote and students to vote. They sought to control women's bodies. We have witnessed class and culture wars, the culture wars being very intimately tied to the class war of the past 45 years. So we are in the midst of a kind of crisis. What we need to do is not allow, for a start, and I'll come to how in a moment, not allow people to tell us we can get back to normal, because normal was, can I use the F word? You don't want me to do that, right?
You
45
can go ahead.
effing years of class war. I don't ever want to go back into that kind of thing. Look at the inequalities that prevail. The numbers are so huge, they almost don't mean anything to us anymore. But we know what working people are enduring. And by the way, even if there hadn't been a pandemic, we were already in the crisis. I was writing about this as a crisis before the pandemic. What the pandemic does is basically enable us to get rid of Donald Trump. And the tragedy is that 300,000 people will have already died to make that happen. And it's just nightmarish. So now how do you do that? Well, first of all, since they smashed labor unions, we don't have the strength in labor that we had previously. However, we still have a great deal of strength in labor. And I honestly can tell you that somehow or other, we have the more progressive labor unions, whether it's the airline flight attendants headed by Sarah Nelson, National Nurses Union, California, called the California Nurses Association, possibly the American Federation of Teachers. I mean, we've seen strikes these past few years. Part of the problem on the left is that it's been all dissociative. We've had these, in lack of a better word, wildcat strikes by teachers in West Virginia, Oklahoma, and places like that. We've had the struggle for the fight for 15. We've had these diverse struggles. One can only hope that we could find those labor leaders who are prepared not only to step forward with their union's backing to call for everyone to join a union and to demand that the likes of Joe Biden live up to his claims, his proclamations about he's, a candidate of labor, and actually say what FDR was supposed to have said in the 30s. It was on posters that the unions put out. Your president wants you to join a union. Okay. And that he then issues an executive order that every federal contract to any private corporation must include the right to collective bargaining and labor union organizing, period. And a minimum wage of 15, though it should probably be $22.50 given productivity changes, and also healthcare. In other words, he can do that by executive order. And that would set an example to the rest of the nation. And hopefully the rest of the nation wouldn't be pissed off by it, but rather say, well, wait, if they can do it, we've got to do it. So I think the best path. Now, the second part of the call for labor to act is that labor must also call for a coalition of left organizations. We have this whole array of left, for lack of a better way of putting it, single interest. By the way, these single interests are in many ways universal interests. The imperative of a Green New Deal, I think we can all recognize, okay? The imperative of voting rights, we can all recognize. So these are the kind of things that we need to create a coalition, and it should be a coalition, call it the struggle for democracy, if you like. That's my preference. Because somebody asked me the other day, well, you're just talking about voting? No. Look, we've got civil rights, political rights. We've got to create not just social rights, which we already have secured some. We have to secure economic rights. We have to get rights into the workplace. Okay, we have to cease to allow the workplace to be a site of dictatorship as opposed to democracy. So, I think labor is the vehicle. And if you don't belong to a union and you can join one, join it. If you know of an organizing effort where you work, get involved in it. And that's to me the best way forward.
Right.
We can go on to other kinds of things, but that's the best way.
No, totally, exactly. I mean, I just want to mention that just today, actually, that New York City fast food workers are now the first in the nation that have won just cause protections through the New York City Council. That meaning that from union workers for the most part, if you're in a union, you can't just be arbitrarily fired. Whereas most workers, which are non-unions, which again. So most workers that are non-unions, which are in fact most workers, don't have that protection that they can be fired arbitrarily. And so it's especially horrible in labor-intensive workplaces where you're sweating labor, you're pushing people to work harder, faster, longer for as little amount of money as possible, and that's the service sector. And so in New York City, this is actually a pretty major win, and so we're hopefully going to cover more of this in the next week or so.
That's fabulous to hear. Thank you for letting me know that, because I also want to say things things have not always been as bleak for labor, and the struggle is, first of all, to redeem the legacy of the past. Wisconsin was the first state in the union to accord public employees the right to collective bargaining and labor organizing, and we lost it. History is not a one way process. New York City was the first major city to accord public employees collective bargaining rights, and it's nice to know that it may well be a jumping off point for workers, fast food workers nationally.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think your answer a moment ago is kind of the perfect encapsulation of this, where and again, we're coming back to this thing that I started with, of like the generation that I'm a part of, and the generation of people who are coming on to the left in the Bernie moment and onward, who now, when we look back to the past, we're looking at 40, 50, and some, more basically like 60 years of defeat, depending on where you're looking. Like rapidly, kind of taking off in the 70s and onward. But there's been so many different attempts at trying to figure out how to reverse that process. And so there's been a lot of different ideas along the way, some good, many I would say are not very helpful or counterproductive. And when we look back to how did we get the progressive outcomes? How did we get better life chances for working people? How did working people's living standards improve? We got to look back to an earlier generation, and we look back to, of course, the civil rights movement in the 60s, but also the labor movement throughout the basically beginning of the 1910s through the 1950s and 60s, and all over the world. We've seen that it really comes down to what you're talking about, that like progressive outcomes are tied to union density and union militancy, union mobilization, unions actually living up to their ideological project, which is we are a democratic institution fighting on behalf of working people's material, economic, social, political interests in the workplace, because that's where the vast majority of us are stuck spending most of our lives. And really, I think part of the left tradition, and I was just emphasizing this a moment ago, and you've been emphasizing this, is that we understand that capitalism is a system based on accumulating profit, that it's almost all derivative from that fact, like both how it works and what the strategies become. Because, when we say we want people to be unionized and we want people in unions to be fighting, there are limitations that are imposed by the fact that corporations are trying to make profit, and some are more profitable than others. And so this is the history of the left. Actually, the good union organizers knew, like, you go into and you organize the most efficient, the most profitable industries or firms in those industries, because you have to start where new capital is gravitating towards. Like, if you're an investor, you want to invest, you don't care what you're making, because the capitalist doesn't give a shit about the actual things that are being made. They don't care about the uses of these things. They care about money. So like they'll invest in whatever. And so they want to go into the industries where there's the most kind of bang for your buck. And so that's also where labor has to be focused on. And that's historically where they have been focused when they have been winning. So that's just more of an addendum to what you've just said. But I wanted to, okay, so there's a couple people who are asking us in the chat about kind of the fight of the week, which has been the strategy proposed by people like Jimmy Dore and others of forcing Pelosi to accept a floor vote on Medicare for all, the Jayapal bill, by kind of holding a mutiny and saying, we're not going to vote for you to be speaker unless we get, I guess a promise of holding a floor vote on Medicare for all. So I was curious, well, I guess the chat's curious, I'm also curious, what your thoughts are. I have some thoughts I'll share in a second, but I want you to take that on first.
Okay, well, let me preface it by just saying that I was on national TV in 2008 because of the Thomas Paine book. It was with Bill Moyers, and it was an interview, the first of several interviews we did. And he and I ended up talking about the Democrats, because in 2006 the Democrats had won back Congress, this was now the presidential. This was the spring, well, January of 2008. So the presidential election season was underway. The primaries were underway, and I said, look, what I don't understand is now that the Democrats have Congress, we know what we need. Look, national health care has been on the agenda since 1944 when Roosevelt proposed the Economic Bill of Rights. It
And
was on
you were just talking about how people overwhelmingly wanted it a
right,
decade earlier.
right. So the question is why in 2018, sorry, did I say no, 2008, right? 2008, the Democrats, once they took power, especially, by the way, I should note, journalists asked Nancy Pelosi back in 2007, I believe, well, now you've got control of Congress. What are you going to do? And she said, I'll give you 3 words. She said, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Well, that seemed to imply they're ready to go for a New Deal, or at least to pursue an enhancement of Social Security and Medicare. And Medicare is part of Social Security. So, but nothing happened of consequence in that sense. So I had said to Bill on again, it's national TV, I said, I don't understand why the Democrats in the House and the Senate don't do kind of like a sense of Congress vote. And the sense of Congress vote would be the pursuit of national health care. That is a priority. They didn't have to have a bill. They could just do a sense of the Senate and whatever it's called in the House, a sense of the House. But of course, they didn't, and they haven't. And as I said before, back in 1944, the opposition was corporate bosses, the AMA, and the Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats would have, if the Southern Democrats weren't worried about desegregation, they would have supported national health care, by the way. They just feared that national health care meant they would have to desegregate the hospitals, period. Well, nowadays, can you believe Northern Democrats are in some ways the obstacle? Now, but I think Jimmy Dore's call was ridiculous. I thought it was ridiculous. The fact is, yeah, don't threaten this or that. Just get Pelosi out. Get Pelosi out, period. If the Progressive Caucus is truly progressive, and clearly the squad itself will have grown in number, you don't need to threaten anything. Just say it's time for new leadership and do it. And then once the House is, whatever transpires, then you take up the campaign. By the way, the other reason I thought Jimmy Dore was wrongheaded is he obviously doesn't know what the hell's going on amongst progressives in the House and the Senate, because Bernie Sanders has repeatedly sent out messages, at least to the mass of us who supported him, saying that he is going to introduce Medicare for all in the Senate. Now, undeniably, it would be great for leverage to bring down Pelosi, but just do it. Okay. It's just clearly going to, it would reverberate in the wrong direction if it fails. Okay. It would be an embarrassment to the squad. Okay. It would have served little purpose ultimately in securing Medicare for all. So, if people are listening who are fans of Jimmy Dore, that's all well and good. I can tell you, I've never, ever watched his show. I only remember him from the Young Turks. He was entertaining on the Young Turks. I have no idea what he's on about these days. And given the kinds of comments people relate to me that he said about Bernie and others, I have very little confidence that he understands much about how to make things happen, either movement-wise or legislatively.
Yeah, I would just add a bit of a contrast.
Please do.
Because not a little bit to what you were saying, but also just because when I'm not doing Jacobin, I'm also a DSA member. I've been involved in the Medicare for All campaign, and part of that, over the course of the last few years, there's been a pressure campaign that DSA has been a part of, which is basically saying that we do, the campaign was saying we want a floor vote on Medicare for all, much like Jimmy's asking for, but the strategy to how you get there is by targeting individual congressmen and women, going to their districts. You make an ask to them. You say, we want you to support Medicare for all. Most likely they're going to say, I like your enthusiasm, kid, but no. And so then what DSA would say is, great, we're going to canvass your district until you say yes. And we're basically going to get the constituency, your constituents, on board with this program so that they're the ones demanding that you end up voting this way. Because what we've just been saying, I mean, most of the way that this progressive change happens, most of it ends up happening with unions and the labor movement and of workplaces and workers fighting back and saying, we demand these things. They're corporations, they're capitalists saying, fine, I'm going to give you your demand because it's not going to hurt me as much as what you're about to cost me. Or the state intervenes to try to remedy the situation and say, we're going to give certain protections, a social wage instead of the wage in the workplace. But we don't have a labor movement, and we should be doing everything we can to be reviving it, because that is truly the key to any kind of forward march towards our
nothing
program.
You said, I didn't find what you said countering. I believe I would love to see a floor vote, but calling for it 1 week and believing that's going to be leverage against Nancy Pelosi the next is foolishness. Right. Yeah, I mean, definitely go out and canvass. Definitely put these folks on target, on the mark. I mean, I don't have any reservations about organizing to literally go in and demand action. It's the idea that you can call for this 1 week and expect them to overthrow the leadership the next with a threat. That's just not going to happen.
So this is what I'm saying, that it's, you know, I mean, ultimately, I don't think a floor vote in and of itself is going to be, you know, it could be important to our process of getting Medicare for all. We might, you know, if we're so lucky, be able to look back and say, yeah, that was an important milestone. It might not. That, you know, there are plenty of important progressive bills that had many floor votes, passed the floor, didn't make it past the Senate, or didn't make it past the president. You know, and those other, you know, those floor votes are forgotten. That might also happen. But, you know, but the point is that the way that you get it, the way that you progress this fight is incredibly important. And so it's, do you have, you know, basically like a, what would you call it? Just like a left media host, you know, basically someone with a large following telling a politician, do this thing, you know, and kind of building up like a general kind of campaign, informal campaign, but, you know, a social media campaign, which are all kind of informal, against, you know, a politician saying like, do the right thing, which, you know, we've seen this play out many times before, and it generally doesn't work because it's not actually dealing with the actual structural and institutional problems that a left politician in a capitalist state is dealing with. And so it's not that you need, it's very specific pressure. It's not just that people want something to happen. People always want something to happen. The point is that, you know, and honestly, the pressure campaign of trying to get the constituents to push a politician into doing something that's a massive economic redistribution might not even be viable. We might find, oh shit, yeah, actually the only way to do this is through the labor movement.
Well, I've been arguing. Look, so I do a radio show every Friday with Jeff Santos, a progressive radio show coming out of Massachusetts. It's on the internet too, if people want. Jeff Santos, and I've been saying for months, you know, that if you want to put people on the spot, make them look morally suspect, then it isn't simply Medicare for all, because they'll turn around and they'll say it'll bankrupt us. And especially now when we have so much, put on the agenda, Medicare for all children. I'm serious. Medicare for all children. And by the way, if they can vote against that, primary every one of them. Okay. I mean, that it's unconscionable if they could say no to that. And by the way, they might well do that, but that's not the point. The point is they'll reveal themselves for the kind of, you know, folks they are. And by the way, once you've done that, you've got it so that, you know, he's already committed to lowering the age for Medicare to 55. Then you've got down here, it'll come soon enough. It'll happen because all those kids will want Medicare when they turn 21.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but I don't know if it will happen. I mean, I think this is the thing, because like, even when you have 80% approval for a policy, it's still, you know, and every single human being organically, biologically needs healthcare. Like
Then we call for
it's
a Million Mom March on Washington.
right, but and so like oftentimes marches are importantly deployed, but like at the end of the day, people have to go
Sure.
home, and
Right. Right.
corporations and politicians
Yeah.
know that like they can withstand a day, a week,
Yeah.
in
No,
the case of
Gail, I'm
Occupy, a
with you.
month.
I
Yeah.
subscribe to everything you said as well. But for those who are impatient and want to see something most immediately to get it out there, I think there are a whole variety of ideas. And doing, by the way, look what this proposal, which, you know, I know a lot of people thought it was just brilliant, but it's been very divisive on the left. It's not been helpful at all.
Right. Well, I think it's. I'm glad that I think that in some ways, I think it is actually very good that we're having a strategic conversation
Uh-huh.
about this. Um, at the same time, I don't know how sophisticated that conversation's been, and but I think that's a growing pain, right? Of kind
Well,
of a
whoever
left
heard of
emerging.
look, seriously speaking, you want to talk real politics? Here's the real politics.
That's what we brought you on.
Okay, real politics is you don't go after you don't challenge your champion who's only spent one term in the House to somehow take, like David taking down Goliath. You
Mm-hmm.
go out and you find the progressive seniors who can begin to do that. That's who you challenge. I mean, I can't imagine expecting any member of the squad, given their junior ranks, so to speak, trying to pull that off. And by the way, I'm going to tell you this: the centrists already have their backup candidate,
Mm-hmm.
and that's Hakeem Jeffries.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and by the way, who, as an African American, would be less susceptible to challenge, just as
Mm-hmm.
Barack Obama did not get the challenge from labor that a white president might have from the left. My point is that we should be careful, and I thought that was an unconsidered argument that Jimmy Dore was making to put AOC on the spot like that. Utterly ridiculous.
Right. Well, there's something. I mean, there are campaigns ongoing. AOC is, she's in a position. She's both. She's highly limited in some regards because she's a lone congresswoman that
Right.
she has one vote, and it's even in kind of the part of the proposal is that the Democrats have lost seats in the House, so there's an opening for just a small handful of Democrats to hold
Yeah.
the speaker
Right.
seat hostage. And sure, true, but like even if you know, I'm not that interested in political promises. I'm interested in political power. Like Pelosi can promise you
Yeah.
anything. Like it doesn't
Right.
mean she's going to do it because at the end of the day, like yes, these are in fact autonomous people that have their own minds and their own feelings and their own motives, but they also exist in a situation in capitalism where they, as politicians, the number one concern, it might not be in the front of their minds all the time, but the number one concern is like they don't get reelected unless there's profitability in corporations, and so they're looking out for. They have to. It's structurally necessary
Yeah,
that
no,
they
I
have.
understand what you're saying. And by the way, it is unconscionable of Nancy Pelosi not to have stepped down on her own volition already. Nobody, you know, it's like she's lost seats.
Right.
Okay, she was lucky. She should never even come back. What after she lost the speakership, it was time for new leadership. I mean, it's just outrageous. I mean, it's you know, Democrats are an embarrassment, frankly, and we know that. But to put on display this kind of argument, to issue this kind of challenge to AOC, that just showed real lack of political intelligence, I think.
Right. Well,
Yeah, we've gone for quite a while.
I know your last point reminds me there was a great piece in Jacobin not too long ago by our friends Danny Bessner and Amber Frost on basically are the Democrats losing on purpose? And spoiler alert, the outcome is like doesn't matter if they are because it seems like they are, like it feels like they are, because but in some sense, like there is just gross incompetence, and then at the same time,
Yes.
there are these, it just comes down to we lack an American labor movement. So like we lack the means to actually force the hand, because an Eisenhower or a Nixon aren't, by virtue of their character, New Dealers in some sense, even though they're Republicans. They end up, basically continuing the New Deal legacy and the New Deal political outcomes because you have the social forces, because you have the labor
That's right.
movement. And in
That's
Nixon's
right.
case, you have the environmental movement with people like Tony Mazzocchi, who is in labor. It's still the labor movement.
Right.
So it's, at the end of the day...
And OSHA, Occupational Safety and
Right.
Health Administration. And by the way, Eisenhower, to whom he was the vice president, Nixon, Eisenhower was the right wingers of the day, the billionaire right wingers of the day, were all demanding that he start acting like the conservative they thought he would be if elected. And as he said to both his press secretary one time and his own brother, who was a right winger, not his liberal brother, he said, any party who goes after labor law, to reverse the powers of labor, to end Social Security, to reduce this and that and this and that, will never be heard from again in this country, because one of every 3 workers was in a labor union.
Right.
And he knew well there was no way that those guys were going to put up with that, any kind of shenanigans. Nowadays, the sad part is we haven't heard enough from labor. We didn't hear enough from labor during the Obama years. We haven't heard enough from labor recent years. And as a consequence, even labor union members all too often have been willing to move to the right because they didn't find the vehicle for their ambitions inside of labor. So it is essential to rebuild labor.
I think that's the perfect message to end on. I think that's our historic task. This is kind of the, whether the left that we find ourselves in right now, has any longevity. I think it's in the next 10 years, it's being able to move from the electoral wins into something that is firmly rooted and grounded and connected to working class people, and the way that, historically they've had power is through unions. So it's building the labor movement. Harvey.
Okay, well, we've gone all over the place, but
yes.
I had a good time.
I think we, I don't know, we took a long road, but sometimes the long road is more enjoyable to get to, we got a fuller picture of, I think, what we were trying to talk about.
Okay.
But
and
people,
I'll talk to you for a second after the...
Yeah, no, well, all the good stuff, all of like the real things that people want to hear is going off camera. But people should read Harvey's books. These are 2 of them. I've read most of The Fight for the 4 Freedoms. It's definitely worth reading. I need to get to the speeches at some point, but soon. And you should also, especially if you enjoyed what we were talking about tonight, you should pick up one of these books, at least one, of Thomas Paine, and Take Hold of Our History. Harvey, thank you again. We'll do this again. We've kind of informally been doing these once a month, so you'll probably see us in January.
And because we never got to the other part, I'm sure we can.
Yeah, we'll finish all the other... It's funny, I have a friend... Okay, this is a tangent, but I have a friend who is at NYU, and Slavoj Žižek will give lectures at NYU because he's technically a professor there. He's a professor at 6 different places.
Honorific things, yeah.
Yeah, but he'll start he'll have like 3 lectures on one topic, and he'll come in on the first day and start talking. He'll go off in a totally different direction, and then at the end say, "Thank you so much. I guess we never got to our topic, but we'll get to it tomorrow." And the next day comes, and it's the same process. And by the end of it, it's, well, next semester we'll come back to this. So until next month, when we pick up something similar and familiar but different. Good seeing you, Harvey. Thank you.
Good to see you too.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.